KaraokeBooks.
The Adventures of Ferdinand, Count Fathom. Tobias Smollett. Audiobook. Chapter 61. Ronaldo meets with a living monument of justice, and encounters a personage of some note in these memoirs. As this domestic was very well qualified for making all the proper dispositions, and adjusting every necessary article on the road, Ronaldo totally abstracted himself from earthly considerations, and mused without ceasing on that theme which was the constant subject of his contemplation. He was blind to the objects that surrounded him, he scarce ever felt the importunities of nature, and had not they been reinforced by the pressing entreaties of his attendant, he would have proceeded without refreshment or repose. In this absence of mind did he traverse a great part of Germany, in his way to the Austrian Netherlands, and arrived at the fortress of Luxembourg, where he was obliged to tarry a whole day on account of an accident which had happened to his chaise. Here he went to view the fortifications, and as he walked along the ramparts, his ears were saluted with these words: "Heaven bless the noble Count de Melville. Will not he turn the eyes of compassion on an old fellow soldier reduced to misfortune and disgrace?" Surprised at this address, which was attended with the clanking of chains, Ronaldo lifted up his eyes, and perceived the person who spoke to be one of two malefactors shackled together, who had been sentenced for some crime to work as laborers on the fortifications. His face was so covered with hair, and his whole appearance so disguised by the squalid habit which he wore, that the Count could not recollect his features, until he gave him to understand that his name was Ratchcali. Melville immediately recognized his fellow student at Vienna, and his brother volunteer upon the Rhine, and expressed equal surprise and concern at seeing him in such a deplorable situation. Nothing renders the soul so callous and insensible as the searing brands of infamy and disgrace. Without betraying the least symptoms of shame or confusion, "Count," says he, "this is the fate of war, at least of the war in which I have been engaged, ever since I took leave of the imperial army, and retreated with your old companion Fathom. Long life to that original genius! If he is not unhappily eclipsed by some unfortunate interposition, before his terrene parts are purified, I foresee that he will shine a star of the first magnitude in the world of adventure." At mention of this detested name, Ronaldo's heart began to throb with indignation, yet he suppressed the emotion, and desired to know the meaning of that splendid encomium which he had bestowed upon his confederate. "It would be quite unnecessary," replied Ratchcali, "for a man in my present situation to equivocate or disguise the truth. The nature of my disgrace is perfectly well known. I am condemned to hard labor for life, and unless some lucky accident, which I cannot now foresee, shall intervene, all I can expect is some alleviation of my hard lot from the generosity of such gentlemen as you, who compassionate the sufferings of your fellow creatures. In order to engage your benevolence the more in my behalf, I shall, if you will give me the hearing, faithfully inform you of some particulars, which it may import you to know, concerning my old acquaintance Ferdinand Count Fathom, whose real character hath perhaps hitherto escaped your notice." Then he proceeded to give a regular detail of all the strokes of finesse which he, in conjunction with our adventurer, had practiced upon Melville and others, during their residence at Vienna, and the campaigns they had made upon the Rhine. He explained the nature of the robbery which was supposed to have been done by the Count's valet, together with the manner of their desertion. He described his separation from Fathom, their meeting at London, the traffic they carried on in copartnership, and the misfortune that reduced Ferdinand to the condition in which he was found by Melville. "After having gratified the honest lawyer," said he, "with a share of the unfortunate Fathom's spoils, and packed up all my own valuable effects, my new auxiliary Maurice and I posted to Harwich, embarked in the packet boat, and next day arrived at Helvoetsluis. From thence we repaired to The Hague, in order to mingle in the gaieties of the place, and exercise our talents at play, which is there cultivated with universal eagerness. But, chancing to meet with an old acquaintance, whom I did not at all desire to see, I found it convenient to withdraw softly to Rotterdam, from whence we set out for Antwerp, and, having made a tour of the Austrian Netherlands, set up our rest at Brussels, and concerted a plan for laying the Flemings under contribution. From our appearance we procured admission into the most polite assemblies, and succeeded to a wonder in all our operations, until our career was unfortunately checked by the indiscretion of my ally, who, being detected in the very act of conveying a card, was immediately introduced to a magistrate. And this minister of justice was so curious, inquisitive, and clear-sighted, that Count Maurice, finding it impossible to elude his penetration, was fain to stipulate for his own safety, by giving up his friend to the cognizance of the law. I was accordingly apprehended, before I knew the cause of my arrest, and being unhappily known by some soldiers of the Prince's Guard, my character turned out so little to the approbation of the inquisitors, that all my effects were confiscated for the benefit of the state, and I was by a formal sentence condemned to labor on the fortifications all the days of my life, while Maurice escaped at the expense of 500 stripes, which he received in public from the hands of the common executioner. Thus have I, without evasion or mental reservation, given a faithful account of the steps by which I have arrived at this barrier, which is likely to be the ne plus ultra of my peregrinations, unless the generous Count de Melville will deign to interpose his interest in behalf of an old fellow soldier, who may yet live to justify his mediation. Rinaldo had no reason to doubt the truth of this story, every circumstance of which tended to corroborate the intelligence he had already received touching the character of Fathom, whom he now considered with a double portion of abhorrence, as the most abandoned miscreant that nature had ever produced. Though Ratchcali did not possess a much higher place in his opinion, he favored him with marks of his bounty, and exhorted him, if possible, to reform his heart, but he would by no means promise to interpose his credit in favor of a wretch self-convicted of such enormous villainy and fraud. He could not help moralizing upon this rencontre, which inspired him with great contempt for human nature. And next day he proceeded on his journey with a heavy heart, ruminating on the perfidy of mankind, and, between whiles, transported with the prospect of revenging all his calamities upon the accursed author. While he was wrapped up in these reveries, his carriage rolled along, and had already entered a wood between Mons and Tournai, when his dream was suddenly interrupted by the explosion of several pistols that were fired among the thickets at a little distance from the road. Roused at this alarm, he snatched his sword that stood by him, and springing from the chaise, ran directly towards the spot, being close followed by his valet, who had alighted and armed himself with a pistol in each hand. About 40 yards from the highway, they arrived in a little glade or opening, where they saw a single man standing at bay against 5 banditti, after having killed one of their companions, and lost his own horse, that lay dead upon the ground. Melville, seeing this odds, and immediately guessing their design, rushed among them without hesitation, and in an instant ran his sword through the heart of one whose hand was raised to smite the gentleman behind, while he was engaged with the rest in front. At the same time the valet disabled another by a shot in the shoulder, so that the number being now equal on both sides, a furious combat ensued, every man being paired with an antagonist, and each having recourse to swords, as all their pieces had been discharged. Rinaldo's adversary, finding himself pressed with equal fury and skill, retreated gradually among the trees, until he vanished altogether into the thickest of the wood, and his 2 companions followed his example with great ease, the valet de chambre being hurt in the leg, and the stranger so much exhausted by the wounds he had received before Rinaldo's interposition, that, when the young gentleman approached to congratulate him on the defeat of the robbers, he, in advancing to embrace his deliverer, dropped down motionless on the grass. The Count, with that warmth of sympathy and benevolence which was natural to his heart, lifted up the wounded cavalier in his arms, and carried him to the chaise, in which he was deposited, while the valet de chambre reloaded his pistols, and prepared for a second attack, as they did not doubt that the banditti would return with a reinforcement. However, before they reappeared, Rinaldo's driver disengaged him from the wood, and in less than a quarter of an hour they arrived at a village, where they halted for assistance to the stranger, who, though still alive, had not recovered the use of his senses. After he was undressed, and laid in a warm bed, a surgeon examined his body, and found a wound in his neck by a sword, and another in his right side, occasioned by a pistol shot, so that his prognostic was very dubious. Meanwhile, he applied proper dressings to both, and, in half an hour after this administration, the gentleman gave some tokens of perception. He looked around him with a wildness of fury in his aspect, as if he had thought himself in the hands of the robbers by whom he had been attacked. But, when he saw the assiduity with which the bystanders exerted themselves in his behalf, one raising his head from the pillow, while another exhorted him to swallow a little wine which was warmed for the purpose, when he beheld the sympathizing looks of all present, and heard himself accosted in the most cordial terms by the person whom he recollected as his deliverer, all the severity vanished from his countenance. He took Rinaldo's hand, and pressed it to his lips, and, while the tears gushed from his eyes, "Praised be God," said he, "that virtue and generosity are still to be found among the sons of men." Everybody in the apartment was affected by this exclamation, and Melville, above all the rest, felt such emotions as he could scarcely restrain. He entreated the gentleman to believe himself in the midst of such friends as would effectually secure him from all violence and mortification. He conjured him to compose the perturbation of his spirits, and quiet the apprehensions of his mind with that reflection, and protested, that he himself would not quit the house while his attendance should be deemed necessary for the stranger's cure, or his conversation conducive to his amusement. These assurances, considered with the heroic part which the young Hungarian had already acted in his behalf, inspired the cavalier with such a sublime idea of Melville, that he gazed upon him with silent astonishment, as an angel sent from heaven for his succor, and, in the transport of his gratitude, could not help exclaiming, "Sure Providence hath still something in reserve for this unfortunate wretch, in whose favor such a miracle of courage and generosity hath interposed." Being accommodated with proper care and attendance, his constitution in a little time overcame the fever, and, at the third dressing, the surgeon declared him out of all danger from his wounds. Then was Rinaldo indulged with opportunities of conversing with the patient, and of inquiring into the particulars of his fortune and designs in life, with a view to manifest the inclination he felt to serve him in his future occasions. The more this stranger contemplated the character of the Count, the more his amazement increased, on account of his extraordinary benevolence in favor of a person whose merit he could not possibly know. He even expressed his surprise on this subject to Rinaldo, who at length told him, that, although his best offices should always be ready for the occasions of any gentleman in distress, his particular attachment and regard to him was improved by an additional consideration. "I am no stranger," said he, "to the virtues and honor of the gallant Don Diego de Zelos." "Heaven and earth," cried the stranger, starting from his seat with extreme emotion, "do I then live to hear myself addressed by that long-lost appellation? My heart glows at the expression. My spirits are kindled with a flame that thrills through every nerve. Say, young gentleman, if you are really an inhabitant of earth, by what means are you acquainted with the unhappy name of Zelos?" In answer to this eager interrogation, Rinaldo gave him to understand, that in the course of his travels, he had resided a short time at Seville, where he had frequently seen Don Diego, and often heard his character mentioned with uncommon esteem and veneration. "Alas," replied the Castilian, "that justice is no longer done to the wretched Zelos, his honors are blasted, and his reputation canker-bitten by the venomous tooth of slander." He then proceeded to unfold his misfortunes, as they have already been explained in the former part of these memoirs, at the recapitulation of which, the heart of Melville, being intendered by his own calamities, was so deeply affected that he re-echoed the groans of Don Diego, and wept over his sufferings with the most filial sympathy. When he repeated the story of that cruel fraud which was practiced upon him by the faithless Ferdinand, Melville, whose mind and imagination teemed with the villainies of Fathom, was immediately struck with the conjecture of his being the knave, because, indeed, he could not believe that any other person was so abandoned by principle and humanity as to take such a barbarous advantage of a gentleman in distress.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.